Historically, disasters have always left a trail of destruction in their wake. From homes swept out into the ocean, to scenes of neighborhoods engulfed in flames or submerged in floodwaters, the impact is undeniable. Yet, despite advancements in building codes and weather prediction, why do disasters still resemble their historic counterparts? And what can we do to better prepare for hazards in the future? On one hand, nature is growing more formidable. Warmer oceans fuel stronger storms, while droughts escalate wildfires. The scale and frequency of natural hazards are generally on the rise. According to the National Centers for Environmental Information, billion-dollar disasters have more than doubled from the 2000s to now, with the average annual number rising from 6.7 in the 2000s to 13.1 in the 2010s and 21.4 in the 2020s thus far. But there's more to the story. As human populations expand, previously untouched landscapes are transformed into bustling communities. Coastal developments, mountain retreats, and urban sprawl encroach upon natural environments once capable of absorbing excess water or minimizing fire risks.
Okay, well, it didn't impact them before, but now that they're developing, they're removing vegetation, they're removing things that was a natural barrier. When you're introducing humans to that, that's when that, natural part kicks in.
There is no such thing as a natural disaster without humans. The disaster is due to the interaction of nature and society, which often results in the destruction of our homes and community.
There are no disasters without impacting people. It impacts where they live, and it impacts how they go about their daily lives.
To confront these challenges effectively, we must take a comprehensive approach, addressing not just the disasters themselves, but the infrastructure and communities they impact. This is Dr. Susan Cutter. She loves pink flamingos and disaster movies. She also has a few distinguished titles to her name. Just a few. With over 30 years of hazards and vulnerability research and education under her belt, it is not an understatement to call her a hazard guru. She and her team here at the University of South Carolina are pioneering this integrated approach to disaster management and community resilience.
What we are trying to do is to be the ultimate integrators of all the disparate elements that need to be considered when working to map and understand hazards and vulnerability. We're going to bring the economics, the hydrology, and the science. We're going to bring culture and history. Only when considering all these parts and pieces can we begin to understand what resilience will mean for a specific place and from specific natural hazards.
There are two sides to hazard and disaster management. It's in the name. A hazard is a threat of an event that will likely have a negative impact. A disaster is the negative impact that follows the occurrence of a hazard. To understand how Dr. Cutter's research is revolutionizing our approach to hazards and disaster management, imagine a community going through a disaster. Think of our community as a vase. It looks beautiful and has specific functions that it can carry out effectively. Before any disaster hits, our community has a certain level of social vulnerability. This is represented by things like how breakable the material is, how heat tolerant the pottery is, and what pieces are more vulnerable to breakage.
Our social vulnerability is those characteristics that may make it less likely for people to prepare, to have the needs and resources to be able to respond and eventually to recover from a hazard event.
When a community is hit by a disaster, it is like the vase has been dropped. Resilience, then, is how effectively we can put the pieces back together, or perhaps use the pieces to build something even better and stronger than before.
So the strength of your social ties, connections across your community, those types of connections and engagements help make a community more resilient. So as they do experience hardships from disasters, they have some internal resources and external connections to help them recover.
To truly mitigate the effect of disasters, it is essential to consider this human element, a community's vulnerability and resilience, as equally important to hazard science as the hazard itself. Today's emergency management professionals take what they learned under Dr. Susan Cutter about vulnerability and resilience and are pioneering ways to integrate this into hazard planning for our cities and towns.
Sometimes we think about buildings collapsing, but we don't think about who's in those buildings or why they're in those buildings. And those are perspectives that I took from my time at the University of South Carolina.
Dr. Cutter's legacy definitely includes the Social Vulnerability Index. I incorporate a lot of what I learned as a student, both in the geography department as a GIS analyst, but also from a research perspective on understanding that interaction of people and places as it creates disasters.
My job as state hazard mitigation officer is to know those communities, know who's at risk, and that is specifically looking at social vulnerability. That is knowing those communities offhand, being able to say, how are we helping those communities? What resources are we providing them?
Through my career at FEMA, we've really used a lot of the data and information that is generated from Susan's lab over the years. Leveraging SHIELDUS, we were able to create loss ratios across the country to actually create the National Risk Index, which incorporates both social vulnerability and community resilience.
The presence of people drives everything we do.
Really, everyone here at EMD interacts with hazards and social vulnerability. The two are tied to emergency management. If we didn't have people and hazards, we wouldn't have emergency management.
We're trying to be more proactive than reactive. Half the battle's being proactive.
We're able to leverage the research that the community produces and use it to apply and make actual changes on the ground within programs and policies.
Instead of saying, oh, well, we're going to build a bridge in this area that keeps flooding, they're going to say, well, why does it keep flooding? Should we maybe invest better into our stormwater infrastructure? Should we maybe, instead of a bridge, do people need to be living in this area?
Emergency management is a group of problem solvers trying to solve a lot of problems, and some problems can't be solved quickly or easily. We will always have hazards, but it doesn't have to be a disaster, is I think how I would put that.
Research indicates that every dollar spent on mitigation saves $11 in recovery costs. But when disaster strikes, recovery funds must be spent wisely to aid those most in need. Hazard mitigation plans now integrate perceived impacts alongside measured data, tailoring recovery strategies to local needs and perceptions. In South Carolina, counties vary in their prioritization of hazards, shaped by geography and community dynamics. The South Carolina Hazard Mitigation Plan, for example, advises on over 18 distinct hazards that have affected South Carolina. However, when we look at emergency management plans on a county level, they only cover a selection of those 18 covered in the statewide mitigation plan. To these communities, only a subset of the natural hazards that impact the state as a whole are perceived as affecting them individually in a significant way. The question then becomes, what makes these communities feel less affected by those hazards they choose not to include?
Understanding local perceptions is essential for guiding effective hazard management. Two communities may experience the same heat index warning, for example, but the impact on those communities can vary widely depending on factors like availability of air-conditioned spaces, public water features, and workplace policies and procedures.
To address these questions, Dr. Cutter and the University of South Carolina Hazards and Vulnerability Research Institute have teamed up with the university partners in Nevada and Idaho to research how perceived and measured climate changes in rural communities across geographic scopes change over time. By identifying commonalities across diverse regions, we can prepare communities for future challenges. How communities experience and recover from events differs based on local context and social structures. Therefore, how we plan and prepare communities for these natural hazards needs to be based in local context and social structures as well. The future of disaster management lies in resilience, building communities capable of withstanding any disaster, regardless of location or circumstance. Dr. Susan Cutter and her students are reshaping emergency management and community resilience, transforming perceptions and practices worldwide and here at home.
I do what I do to make discoveries to improve lives and livelihoods, to make a real difference, not to publish papers. I see the impact of my work most when people are experiencing some of the hardest moments of their lives. They are able to experience a moment of relief when their governments and communities have the bandwidth and know-how to support them. That is the most important thing, improving how we measure and consider disasters today to affect how we react tomorrow. In other words, translating the science into practice.
We are Gamecocks. We are game changers.